This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, cultural workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Tamara J. Walker, who teaches in the Department of Africana Studies at Barnard College. Her work explores race, travel, movement, and place in both Latin American history, which produced the book Exquisite Slaves, Race, Clothing, and Status in Colonial Lima from 2017, and in stories of African American global travel in her recent book Beyond the Shores, A History of African Americans Abroad from 2023. In this conversation, we discussed the place of Latin America in the Black Studies imagination, the meaning of movement and travel for understanding Black life, and how inter- and multidisciplinary approaches to Black life change historical writing. Good morning, Tamara. How are you?
Good morning. Thanks for having me. I'm doing okay.
Well, welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. As I was saying before we started, one of the efforts I'm trying to make, or Ashley and I are trying to make in this podcast over the next year, is getting more and more representation of people in the field of Black studies working on Latin America. So in addition to just being interested in your thoughts and your work, also representing that aspect of Black studies, which I think remains really underrepresented, is really important to me. And so along with all those things, welcome, and I really appreciate you making the time to talk today.
It's my pleasure.
Well, let me start with a question. We'll have a chance to talk about your work and how you think about the field of Black studies and your work in relation to it. But I want to start with a more personal question, really, which is just to ask you, what drew you to the study of Black life? What drew you to interest in Black studies? And for me, always a sort of companion question with that, which is what sustained you in relation to this kind of work?
I would say I kind of stumbled into the study of Black life. I had always been interested in travel, which I know we'll talk about. I'm from Colorado. I grew up in a military family. I was surrounded by artifacts of travel and just had always had this longing to leave my hometown, I think, in the way a lot of people feel as teenagers. And I went to this high school that had this program that was called Interim. It was a private high school in Denver. And we had various opportunities to travel. And I had traveled with my Spanish teacher to Mexico for 2 weeks. And then that planted a seed that led to me wanting to study abroad in a Spanish-speaking country. When I was in college at Penn, I majored in Spanish and later in history. So I knew I wanted to go somewhere where I could immerse myself in a Spanish-speaking environment. And because I only had a semester to be away rather than a year, if I had had a year, I probably would have gone to both a European country and a Latin American country. And for various reasons, was only able to spend a semester away. And so I ended up choosing the Paris of the Americas. I went to Argentina. I went to Buenos Aires, and my experience
They
there.
do love calling it the Paris of the Americas.
They
It's a
do,
great city.
and it's earned that name for various reasons, architecturally speaking, culturally speaking, in a lot of ways. But my experience there was really challenging, and it just made me ask a lot of questions that I hadn't really thought about. And I had studied Argentina. I had taken classes in the history of modern Latin America. That was why I chose to be there. I was part of a research program that was really kind of it gave shape to my study abroad experience. The idea was that we would do independent research and produce not senior thesis projects, but produce research that would then lead to senior thesis projects once we got back to our home institutions. So I was already aware of where I was going and thinking deeply about where I was going, but wasn't really prepared for the experience of being Black in Argentina. And this was in the 90s. I was there in 99. And this was pre-social media, although I like to say that if I had gone there in the era of social media, I probably wouldn't have gone. But
Interesting, yeah.
And I have a whole rant about that I can come back to. And so I just was really kind of shocked and uncomfortable in ways that proved really productive for me. They got me interested in the Black presence in Argentina this question of why I felt like I stood out, why I was being stared at all the time, why I was being made to feel uncomfortable, and just various kind of rumblings around me just got me really curious. And so it was through that experience that I became really interested in studying the Black presence in Argentina, that then became a broader interest in Blackness in Latin America, first through the history of slavery and racial formation, and then thinking about its legacies in the modern era, and then moving into other arenas that have to do with visual representation, visual discourses, themes of global Black mobility. But all of that really came out of my own mobility and my own experiences through that mobility that in turn really shaped my intellectual trajectory and preoccupations, honestly.
So how does that, I mean, I'm curious also, I mean, it's a compelling experience, and the Paris of the Americas has all of its fantasies of whiteness, as you were talking about. I mean, it is always interesting to me, these stories where it's, about how people get into the study of Black life. Sometimes it's sort of being surrounded by the sort of plenitude of representations, but then there's also this moment of like, what's missing, what stories are missing, what presences are missing, or even just what vocabulary of the nation is missing. And so these shifts and differences are always really interesting to me about how that plays out in terms of scholarship and new projects and really transformative projects in terms of understanding South America. So, but how does that then translate into graduate school? Because that's, working on Blackness in Latin America it's not like there's multiple sorts of programs and an overwhelming number of people. So was that also like a challenge, or was this really just where you had to forge your own space?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very different landscape now than it was 25 years ago when I was applying to graduate school. And I knew really early on in my application process that I wanted to apply to history departments. I was a Spanish and Latin American studies major, but I realized that the bulk of the courses I was taking in Latin American studies, or to fulfill that major, were in history. And so there was something about the professors I was learning from, the texts that we were reading, the methods that those texts were showcasing, that just felt right to me. And I had already had this experience of independent research from my time studying abroad in Argentina. And so that gave me a framework in which to kind of orient my plans for graduate school. And then the other thing I should mention is that I was a member of what was then called the Mellon Minority Undergraduate Fellowship Program at Penn, and it's now called the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship Program. But the mission of that program has always been the same, which is to increase faculty representation of diverse people in higher ed. And they've had to kind of tweak how they articulate that mission over the years. But the idea was to prepare people to apply to graduate school and to succeed in graduate school and to enter the academic profession and to thrive therein. And the saying with the Mellon program is once a Mellon, always a Mellon, which means a lot to me right now because I'm now the faculty coordinator at Barnard for the Mellon program. But at the time I was an undergraduate, it was a really important community and source of support for preparing for graduate school, doing research, having a faculty mentor, preparing for graduate admissions exams, preparing for visiting campuses and reaching out to professors and asking them about their research. And so through that, I applied to a lot of history departments and got into a number of graduate programs and ended up going to the University of Michigan, both because of the cohort that I was going to be part of. It happened that a lot of us were accepted into the same programs and ended up just kind of having this informal sense of like, well, if it's all the same, if these are all really strong departments that offer really rigorous course loads and research possibilities and the like, then may as well go where we can be in community and with people that we enjoy. And obviously the other pull were the faculty and the intellectual community. And I was already sensing that my work, while grounded in history, was going to be interdisciplinary. And maybe that sense came through visiting Michigan and having that sense of just how interdisciplinary that space and so many of the scholars making their intellectual home in that space were. And so it felt like a really good fit for me. And it ended up being a really good fit for me in terms of the people that I studied with. My primary advisor is an historian of Cuba, Rebecca Scott, who really, in her teaching and her reading of my work and in her example, really shaped the way I read and write and think and research. So I felt like I was on track for a really solid training as an historian of Latin America, and then increasingly an historian of Blackness in Latin America. And Rebecca was really instrumental to me becoming an historian of slavery as an historian of slavery herself. And I remember going back to Argentina after going as an undergrad in the summer between my first and second year of my PhD program, and finding it frustrating that when I was wanting to kind of talk to people about Blackness in modern Argentina, people kept saying that I was barking up the wrong tree, looking in the wrong place. You need to go to Brazil for that. And so one of the pieces of advice that she gave was to go back to a point in time where the Black presence was undeniable because it was documented on record. And for various reasons, that points to the history of slavery, where that presence is undeniable and where there is this attempt to chronicle and document the presence of people of African descent. And that just made a lot of sense to me. And so through that, I started to develop an interest in what became my dissertation and first book on slavery and dress in Colonial Lima, pivoting away from Argentina. Or I now realize that what I did was kind of put my relationship with Argentina on pause. To come back to it later. But at the time, what was happening? I'm from Colorado. I worked at this Peruvian restaurant in the months before I went to Argentina as an undergraduate. And I just remember the people at the restaurant being very surprised that I was going to Argentina and wondering very proudly why I wasn't going to Peru. And so there was something about that experience and just like their love for Peru and their attempt to kind of impart that love for Peru through showing me videos and telling me stories and introducing me to music that made me always want to go there. And I had thought when I went to Argentina as an undergrad that I might detour there, thinking that it would be like Europe where you could like hop on a bus or a train and move easily from one country to another. And then, of course, I realized that things would be much more complicated. So I'd always kind of had this sense like Peru seems like a really interesting place. And so when I was feeling kind of wobbly about Argentina, I was like, let me see what I can figure out about Peru. And then I had this interesting kind of archival experience at the University of Michigan at the Clements Library, where I was taking a class with Professor Foma Nwankwo, who's now at Vanderbilt, but was taking a class on global Black literatures. And she took us to the Clements Library and kind of set us loose to just roam around and poke through the catalog. And I happened to find this travel account written by a woman, an Austrian woman who had traveled, among other places, to Peru in the 19th century, arrives there shortly after the abolition of slavery. And she had this description of her time there. And in her text, she talks about her observations of Indigenous and African descent women and how they were dressed. And it was just such a intriguing and jarring characterization that it just became this rabbit hole for me, where I was so intrigued by how she was describing these women dressed in luxury, but she also had this kind of disdainful characterization of them, describing their clothes as ragged and hanging half off. And then she really disparagingly refers to them as looking like pigs with gold necklaces. And so there was just so much in there that I just wanted to untangle. I had so many questions about how these women acquired the clothing they wore, what it meant for them to wear those items of clothing, a couple years after the abolition of slavery, and how they viewed themselves. And if there was a way to get at that and to move beyond the way this European woman was so disdainfully describing them. And so that became the basis of my dissertation and later my first book.
Yeah, no, it's super fascinating. I spent a decent amount of time in Peru. We've talked some of the time about it. And so I was really interested in your book for that reason. And when you say that, is there an easy sort of get on a bus or train? Having taken a bus from Lima to La Paz to Montevideo, it's a journey of a very particular kind. I went also during a workers' strike. So there were some informal buses. But younger days. Well, let me make kind of an abrupt shift and ask you about the field of Black studies. You're in the Department of Africana Studies, and interested in how, and especially given your narrative that you just gave us, interested in how the field of Black studies appears as sort of portrait for you. How do you understand the field? It has its origins in sort of two movements. One, the demand by students on campuses for there to be a place to study Black life, that the disciplines had not done this kind of work, and that this was the kind of thing that Black Studies department could do to study, cultivate, and grow the intellectual tradition. But that was also a time in the late 1960s and early 1970s where Black liberation struggle had radicalized, and that those distinctions between study and prescriptive political action, between campuses and communities, had really been broken. And so, I feel like the sort of political demands of Black studies in terms of community action and the intellectual demands of Black studies in terms of the study of Black life, there's a tension there at the origin of Black studies that is still with us. And so I'm interested in how you think about that when you think about, what Black studies is for you and for your kind of research.
I think of Black studies as an umbrella. And I come to Black studies, or I'm in an Africana Studies department, after having spent my entire career up until this point, until a couple years ago, in history departments. I trained as a colonial Latin Americanist. I had jobs as the resident colonial Latin America historian, taught courses on colonial Latin America, on slavery in Latin America. And then as I started to evolve in some of my work, I was teaching under that particular umbrella in ways that reflected that new work on, for example, race and visual culture in Latin America, and had developed courses on Afro-Latin America in the artistic imagination that were deeply grounded in history and historical methods, but that were also, just by their nature, interested in other disciplinary approaches and other media when it came to depicting the experiences of Afro-Latin Americans and the perspectives of Afro-Latin Americans. And so there was a moment, because of that work and those interests, that I started to think, okay, maybe there's another umbrella for me to stand under. And then around the same time, I had also just been thinking about the kind of thinker I wanted to be, the kind of storyteller I wanted to be, and had, for various reasons, begun to think about writing a book about travel. And I would never, as I've already mentioned, have become an historian of Latin America without the experience of traveling abroad. And so much of my experiences of traveling abroad as just a civilian, but also as a scholar, were shaped by my Blackness. And so I just had been wanting to write something that spoke to that. And so then I started to set out on the journey of writing my book Beyond the Shores, which is a history of African Americans abroad. And so then I started to feel like, gosh, how do I describe myself now? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't capture everything to describe myself as a colonial Latin America historian. And so I started to wonder, well, maybe this is a moment to think about other intellectual homes. And it's not to say that I could not have made my home and continued to work in a history department, and I was quite happy in my job at the University of Toronto in the Department of History, and feeling like there were lots of ways forward. But I was also just kind of wondering, and increasingly I just was starting to form this question of, well, what might it look like to work in an Africana Studies department where it might make it a little bit easier to describe the work that you do, that encompasses these different book projects and also creates the conditions of possibility for ever more expansive projects that aren't so grounded in that kind of colonial Latin America frame that had been framing so much of my work for so long. Mm. And so that's what made me apply to the job that I now have in an Africana Studies department at Barnard. And it continues to be this umbrella for me. And I've started to kind of think about my work as, among other things, kind of interested in Black people out of place, Black people where you don't expect to find them, Black people often in these kind of solitary moments and conditions, which probably traces back to me being a Black person in Colorado, in a place where people don't tend to associate Black people with living, despite the fact that it wasn't just myself and my family in Colorado. There is this deep and long history of a Black presence in Colorado, which is also true of Argentina, which is also true of Peru, which is also true of the various places I follow, the people that I write about, and beyond the shores. And so I think that, if anything, is kind of the through line in a lot of the work that I do. Mm-hmm. And it makes being in an Africana Studies department just make a lot of sense for me.
So if I can follow up on that, I mean, I think you've spoken really in really interesting ways to how to how Black Studies informs your research, Black Studies sensibilities, whether it's the multidisciplinary or sort of through line, as you said, this question of Black people where they're not expected to be. What does it mean to document that? As well as and as well as how that turns into, for me, really what your kind of work does to the field of Black Studies, mm-hmm. which is to open these questions of places where, because I do think Black Studies as a field has really gone to places where you expect to see Black people, the mm-hmm. Caribbean, United States, Africa, maybe Black Europe, but I think that still sort of falls under those categories. And I'm interested in this question specifically in terms of you having come recently to an Africana Studies department. I think it's really interesting that the perspectives of people who have undergraduate and graduate degrees and then work in Africana, but also people who come to it at a different phase of career. And so all that's to say, a way of asking this question is how in arriving in an Africana Studies department, you've said a lot about just now how it affects how you think about your own research, or how it sort of frees up a sort of voice or perspective or orientation. But I'm also interested in how an Africana Studies classroom looks different mm-hmm. for you than mm-hmm. a history classroom.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I think the hardest adjustment for me to make was to the classroom, the new kind of classroom that I was inhabiting. So one of the courses I teach at Barnard is a course called the Introduction to the African Diaspora. And my first year teaching it, I had this really interesting experience of encountering students who weren't all that interested in history. And it made me think back to the kind of students I was getting when I was in history departments, from graduate school to early career to University of Toronto. And those were students who either had come to college to be history majors or who understood just by living in the world that they had to have some kind of understanding of history, but more likely they were fulfilling a history requirement. And so they were either people who wanted to be there or people who understood that they had to be there to fulfill degree requirements. And so there was some degree of buy-in But with a lot of the students I was getting in Africana Studies, there wasn't that expectation because it wasn't in the name of the course, and it wasn't something that they immediately associated with it. They were bringing a lot of other expectations to the class. And I think some of this is generational and some of this is contextual, that a lot of the students were quite presentist. And I remember having these moments and experiences with the students who were like, I'm not really interested in history. And here I was, because of my training and because of my decades of teaching experience, focused on really kind of now arcane, but, also meaningful distinctions between, for example, 16th and 17th century Brazil and regional differences, things that I was able to kind of tease out and guide students through in my Colonial Latin America survey, right? And so it was just a moment of clarity on my part, where I realized, one, that I couldn't bring the same assumptions into that classroom space that I was bringing into the Colonial Latin America survey, just to kind of compare apples and apples, these kind of intro gateway courses to the major. And instead had to start from a different premise. How do I make students care about history, which is important training for the moment that we live in right now, in fact. So that was a good lesson to learn, not to kind of take for granted that there's buy-in for the discipline. And it's a good challenge, I think, for us all to grapple with. And, just to your earlier framing around how Black studies emerged in response to student demands, I think about that often in my classroom. What students want, because they are so grounded in and mindful of the present, they're constantly making connections between past and present, even if they're distant past or in different and distant places. They're making connections to their here and their now. And so I've started to kind of see my job as helping them do that in rigorous and critical ways, without making too many leaps and without taking for granted historical context, regional context, things of that sort. But it's been an interesting challenge, and I think in some ways a really invigorating challenge that has kind of shaken any inclination out of me that I could teach the same stuff for years on end. I mean, we shouldn't ever do that anyway. Yeah. But sometimes it's easy to kind of get on autopilot. And it was a moment of reckoning that I couldn't do that. Not if I wanted to keep my students invested in the semester and have them come back to my other classes, right? And so it really has made me rethink how I structure courses. And I changed that course and changed it to more kind of thematic explorations of, one, what does it mean to be an African diaspora? How does an African diaspora even come into being? What does it mean to forge diasporic connections? What does it mean to live in and move through an African diaspora? And so it was important work, and it was an important challenge to encounter and navigate.
So you're bringing me back to 2004 when I transitioned from philosophy departments to Black studies. And it's interesting. I mean, I think about that a lot. I mean, it's, whatever, it's good, retrospective, sometimes. And it's the intro course for me as well. And what I remember students saying, this class is so theoretical. I was like, it's a fucking philosophy. Oh, no, it's a Black studies class. That's right. It's not a philosophy class. But that was for me a really important intellectual moment. It was pedagogical because, as you say, you have to communicate with students, have to take future courses, and hopefully major or minor, and all of that. But also intellectually understanding that a Black Studies or Africana Studies department has its own challenges, and that we engage that challenge rather than just sort of it doesn't adopt to us. It doesn't adapt to us. We adapt to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me ask you as a sort of final couple questions. First question, and this is, I know it's a peculiar question because, in many ways, as you were saying, it's new to identification with the field, but also having engaged with this question of Blackness and multiple geographies. Also, I imagine an intimate question, but which is, what do you think in the history of Black studies, or maybe more appropriately put, the study of Black life, what do you think has been done well in the history of the field in this area of study? But also, what do you think has not been done so well?
Maybe I'll answer that by talking about the way I'm approaching my work that has been different than the way I have approached my work in the past, and that I think will shape my work in the future, which is through writing for large publics. And, my first book was based on my dissertation that had been written for my community, my committee, but also my kind of intellectual community. But those were people who were reading a lot of the same books as me and in a lot of the same conversations that I was in. And I was very much speaking to them, right? I mean, both as a dissertation that is meant to serve a particular purpose, and then later as a book that is meant to serve a particular purpose for a larger audience, but nonetheless one that you've kind of been in conversation with. Whereas when I wrote Beyond the Shores, first of all, I wrote it with a trade publisher, right? I got an agent and we sold the book, and I published it with Crown, which is a division of Penguin Random House, and I had a very different editorial experience. It really changed so much of how I approach my work from here on out, that there was just so much attention to not just content, but to form.
Mm-hmm.
And it enabled me to think of myself as a writer, not just a scholar, not just
Interesting.
an intellectual, but a storyteller. And it then kind of animated me to move in a couple of other circles of writers, for example. So I did a workshop with Tin House, and really was just kind of in groups with people who had nothing to do with history, with Latin America, with the study of slavery, with any of the kind of cohorts I had been part of. And they were just people who were interested in creative nonfiction. And so it required me to be more attentive to how I tell the story and how I reach that kind of broad audience of people who are interested but not versed, not learned. How do we write in ways that reach those people? Which I had thought about, when I was coming up, just in broad terms, like I want my family to be able to read my work, but I hadn't really thought about how to do that. It was just a desire, but it hadn't really translated into process. And so that's something I just have been thinking a lot about. And I think that there are important stakes attached to that. There's obviously good reason to treat our work as complex, and to approach it with the care and rigor and complexity it deserves. And one thing I always tell my students, especially in this first year class, I'll ask them, what brought you to this class? What made you want to take this course at this point in your career or in your life? And a lot of them will say, I never got this kind of content in high school. And I understand where they're coming from in terms of not feeling as though their high school curricula attended very much to Black life and Black history. But I often tell them, well, I'm teaching you this material precisely because you're a college student, or precisely because you're a graduate student. We don't say that about chemistry. We don't say that about math. Like, I didn't get this stuff in high school, right?
Yeah.
There's college level chemistry, there's college level math, right? It requires that they have a particular kind of a foundation. And so I acknowledge all of that, right? The importance of having kind of building blocks to be able to engage the field in a thoughtful way. At the same time, I also think that we're in a moment right now where the public would very much benefit from the work that we do, and it's being taken away from the public, right?
Yeah.
That archives are being taken offline, scholarship is being taken off of government websites, and I was talking to my students about the recent incident involving the entry on the National Park Service related to Harriet Tubman, and how emblematic it is of what we're up against. That entry was butchered. So it was hollowed out into word salad, right? Such that you read it and you would never be able to answer the question of what the Underground Railroad was. And I was trying to understand what produced that entry. Was it a Chat GPT prompt? Was it a deeply cynical Chat GPT prompt? I actually tried in all these different ways to reproduce that via Chat GPT and got pretty close, which tells me that there's both kind of deeply cynical prompting at work, but also really, really heavy intervention on part of people who are determined to tell a particular kind of story and hollow out a particular kind of story. And so those are going to be, and obviously because of public outcry, the original entry was put back online. And that tells us that public outcries still work, right?
Yeah.
But it also is a window onto what this administration is doing with our work, with our history, and all the more reason, really, for us to be targeting the public and finding ways to reach high schoolers, college students, ordinary people with our work and speak on different registers to those different audiences. But the one that I've been thinking a lot about lately is that public reader, the reader of creative nonfiction works, the reader of thoughtful articles. And I have published a fair amount of pieces, both since publishing Beyond the Shores and just in general in outlets like Time and Smithsonian Magazine and even Afar, this travel magazine, with that in mind, that there are so many ways for the work that we do, the research that we do, the kind of thinking that we do to be translated to these general audiences and to reach them where they need us most. And the other thing I'll say is that I have this new project on this figure from the history of piracy that I had been for a long time really disinclined to write and think about. And I had wanted to steer various conversations I'd been part of through this Netflix documentary where I was a talking head, to this PBS project where I was working as both the kind of producer and scriptwriter. And I realized, because I kept getting questions about this figure, this Black pirate, even when I refused to kind of talk about him on camera, I would get emails, I would get different forms of outreach. And it was just telling me, okay, well, the public clearly wants to hear about this person. And that gives me a choice. And it's a consequential choice, right? I can either kind of frame my work in accordance with the way I see it and kind of sidestep conversations I don't really want to have, or I can meet the public where it clearly needs us most. And what better kind of use of my skills and my critique than taking on this subject. I'm being intentionally vague because I'm still trying to get the book proposal out the door. What better call, right, than to answer this one from the public that is saying, this is something that we're interested in. And I think, people really love history. People really love studying the past.
That's true.
And I mean, there's so many podcasts that are tremendously popular. Rarely are they ever hosted by historians, right? All these history podcasts and all of these kind of TikTok accounts, right? And so people are really curious and engaged in the subjects that we work in and teach in and write about. And they're going to stay interested with or without us. So I think that gives us a choice.
I love that. This is a wonderful place for us to wrap up because it really gets to, I think, the heart of so much of what the field of Black studies originally wanted, which was this crossing of boundaries between political intervention and intellectual life. And this speaks to it in our writerly selves. And I really love that. So thank you. Thank you for making the time for this. And this has been a fantastic conversation. I just appreciate your thoughtfulness so much. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right. Take care.